You can help support the channel by heading to our merchandise store and picking up some of our great aircraft designs created by our graphic designer. We have everything from fighters to transport aircraft, which you can choose to have printed on t-shirts, mugs, stickers and much more. Head to the description below and click the links and pick up your design today. Thank you and enjoy.
I guess maybe switch to the F-16 now.
Yeah, let's go for a couple of stories on the F-16, Carl.
So as people, if people have not seen your previous videos with me, after 1986, so right after El Dorado Canyon, I had already, decided to volunteer to be an air liaison officer, and the promise was, well, after you do this terrible deal working as an Air Force officer with the Army, which turned out not to be that terrible. I actually liked it. So to me, I was just fine. And it was very interesting because I got to learn a lot about the Army but your viewers want to learn about the Air Force. So we'll pass that. But the bottom line is after that tour, I got switched to the F-16 and I ended up flying the F-16 at Hahn Air Base in Germany for about 2.5 years. At the time, the F-16 did not have AMRAAMs yet, so we were guns on AIM-9s only. But no, we did have the pretty good AIM-9 for the time, AIM-9 Mike, which was indeed capable of frontal aspect engagement, assuming that the target was fast enough and did not use counter-IR tactics, which means reducing power and flares. So, if they were using those, they could avoid a frontal engagement as well. But when we were fighting, mostly the Bitburg F-15s was one of our main adversaries that we used to engage in DACT with. It was kind of a disadvantage because, of course, they did not have AMRAAM at the time either, but they did have AIM-7s. So they had the AIM-7F and then the M model, which was pretty capable, although it did require them to keep a lock on the target for engagement. So at the time, we did do the ACT on a fairly regular basis with them, although our main mission at Hahn was air-to-ground, including the nuclear mission. But we did do a fair amount of DACT, and one of our main bases that we would, engage with is the Bitburg F-15. So, because they were always looking for dissimilar adversaries, and Hahn was not very far from Bitburg, so it allowed us to go to a training area which wasn't too far, and we would have a lot of fuel to process, multiple engagements during one sortie, even though for air-to-air, we would only carry typically the centerline tank, not the wing tanks. But again, because we didn't have far to go to the area, that left us plenty of fuel. So what was interesting about engaging the F-15 back then was we would have to, do all kinds of tactics to avoid their AIM-7s, and then, try to see if we could get in a close-in engagement fight with them, at which point then the odds were a lot more even. I would say they weren't quite even in the sense that air-to-air was all they did. So obviously compared to our maybe 40% at the most of sorties dedicated to air-to-air, and even when I say 40%, that's pretty optimistic. I think on average it was closer to 30%, so maybe 1/3. And a lot of those were BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, so maybe one-on-one, and only a few were dissimilar air combat tactics sorties, so like 4v4. So they did have a pretty significant advantage in that sense, but in my opinion, it was more than offset by the fact that we were way smaller. So our visual signature was a lot smaller. And one of the biggest advantages we had was that once we got into a turning fight with the F-15s, they would lose sight a lot, whereas it was much easier for us to keep track of where they were. Yeah. It's particularly important when you do anything above a 2v2, because 2v2, you can sort of keep track of where people are at, although even that takes a bit of effort, particularly in the days before, Link 16, JTIDs, all that stuff that are in the modern versions of all these aircraft. This was before that time. So, maintaining situation awareness was paramount, and that was quite difficult at times. But once we got into a turning fight, I think the overall advantage turned to the F-16 simply because not so much of the aircraft's maneuverability being superior or anything. They were pretty evenly matched, in my opinion. Now, the higher you went, the more the F-15 had the advantage, and the lower you went, the more the F-16 had the advantage, in general. But the pilot would make most of the difference. But again, the size of the aircraft made a huge difference. They would lose sight of us all the time. And then when, lose sight, lose fight. So it was pretty simple. And that allowed us to have a pretty respectable exchange ratio against them in general. I mean, I'm not going to brag and say that we would beat the F-15s all the time. That would not be true. For sure, they were very good because that's all they did. And so you would expect them to be. But again, when you lose situation awareness because you can't see the other aircraft in a turning fight, that's pretty deadly. One time when I was fighting F-15s from Bitburg, suddenly one of them started spewing smoke big time from the back end. I'm like, what? And that's why I say, knock it off, basically terminate the engagement. Because I thought he had a serious problem. And then everybody was ribbing on me for calling knock it off. Say, that's no big deal. That happens all the time in the F-15. It's a compressor stall and it just recovers by itself and no big deal.
Wow.
Not a big thing. But I'm like, for them, it was no big deal because they were two engine. And I guess that's the way they were, considering it. They would just, the engine would recover by itself and then they just continue the fight. So I was told, well, don't do that again. I was like, well, I didn't know. I see smoke coming out. Well, there was no flame. It's just pure smoke. But in the F-16, though, if the same thing happened, which did, occasionally, I had compressor stalls. It was very rare, but it did happen a couple of times. And, even though the engine would recover and everything was fine, for us, it was like, okay, you return to base immediately. Right. So there was no let's continue the engagement because single engine. So, different mentality in that respect.
Of course, yeah.
So these were really good times. Later on, when I was flying the F-16 at Kunsan in Korea, that was in the 90s, mid 90s, and by that time we had the AIM 120, the B model at the time, if I remember well, of the AIM 120. And we would set air defense alert, which something that we did not do at Han. We would have had an air defense role in the early days of any war with the Warsaw Pact in Germany, in the Cold War era, and we did practice that quite a bit. But we did not pull permanent alert in the air-to-air role, right? And also by that time at Han, we also no longer pulled nuclear alert on a permanent basis. It would be generated occasionally for exercises to practice, regenerating the capability. But unlike in the F-111 at Lakenheath, where I did pull alert, for nuclear mission 1 week at a time, that was about 1 week out of every 6 weeks or so, we had nuclear alert duty. By the time I got in the F-16, even though the mission was still there, we no longer, it was already, under the Gorbachev era. So technically we were still, enemies with the Soviet Union, but relations had relaxed to the point where it was no longer deemed necessary to have a permanent nuclear alert. So now SAC, that's a different story. Strategic Air Command, that's different. But for the tactical force, we were no longer doing that on a regular basis. But at Kunsan, to get back to my story, at Kunsan, we did not on a permanent basis, but we did generate air-to-air air defense alert once in a while, and the aircraft were loaded with 4 AMRAAMs and 2 AIM-9s, which was pretty cool. And we would practice scrambles. No, I don't remember having to do a real one ever. I mean, the Korean Air Force would normally deal with the real scrambles.
Right.
But for us, we did do practice scrambles, so, and, it was pretty cool to see F-16s taking off with that kind of load on it. It was not that often, but to me, it was always cool to watch them take off. When we were doing these scrambles, I was working in the command post. I was the chief of plans at Kunsan for a while, so I would be part of the crew monitoring what's going on, and so I never scrambled myself on an air defense scramble like this at Kunsan with that kind of ordnance, live ordnance, but it was very interesting. What we did do, but this is back at Han, is during what was called the Salty Nation exercise. So these were NATO led exercises that basically gauge your readiness to perform your mission. We did do scrambles all the time for air-to-air, and what we would do is we would be tasked to do low altitude combat air patrol, with the F-15s being at high altitude, and we would scramble to an air defense combat air patrol orbit somewhere in Germany, and we would wait there until we were vectored to various threats, which, of course, the threats at the time were all simulated. Could be anything from, German airplanes, RF, anything that was willing to be intercepted, including C-130s, sometimes transport planes.
Okay.
And they would scramble us and say, okay, this is a bad guy, just go ahead and go shoot it down. Of course, all simulated. But that was extremely interesting. And the first day and a half of the 1 week long exercise in the F-16 was pretty much dedicated to air-to-air. And then we would slowly shift to a conventional air-to-ground roll. And then the last day of the exercise, or maybe the Thursday afternoon to into the Friday of that week, was a slow shift to the nuclear mission and practice that, which was very important because in that mission, there was no room for error, right? In a way, the nuclear mission was the easiest as far as tactics and, because you didn't have a lot of room for improvising anything, so basically you fly your black line. Yeah, if you get jumped, you do have to react to the threat, but you get back on the black line as soon as possible. But so from that point of view, it was relatively easy. They were single ship missions too. So you didn't have to worry about a wingman. You didn't have to worry about coordinating, tactics with somebody else. You were on your own. So from that point of view, it was easier, but you were not allowed a single error in the procedures. One error and you failed. That's it.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it was pretty demanding. And you were monitored. You basically, if you were picked as somebody that they were going to basically evaluate during the most of the missions, what they would do is evaluate after the fact. Now, of course, so that the viewers don't misunderstand. Even though we were practicing the nuclear mission, we had no actual weapons loaded on the aircraft when we were doing that. Okay, so that's something everybody has to understand. They would load the real weapons on the ground. The inspectors would check that everything had been done properly, and then they would download the weapons. And then the next day, we would fly an equivalent mission with either no ordnance, just purely simulated, or on a rare occasion, they would put a fake nuclear shape on there, and you would go to a range and drop it. But that did happen, but that, it was just maybe 1 or 2 missions would do that out of the many missions that were being evaluated that day. Most of the missions, what they would do is just look at your heads-up display and radar tape after the fact. When you came back, you're supposed to tape everything, and then the inspectors would say, "Okay, show me what you did," and they would look that you were on target, on time, and fine, you pass. Occasionally, though, they would chase you in an airplane, so they would have a two-seater F-16. Most of the inspectors were not F-16 pilots. They might be an RAF Jaguar pilot, or whatever, anything, or German F4 pilot. That were just there as an inspector. So they would put him in the back seat of a two-seater and chase our airplane to the target and back to evaluate how you did. So that was a small percentage of the missions, though. Most of us were evaluated simply by looking at the tapes afterwards. But it was a huge deal. So very demanding, the F-16, multi-role, so it was, from that point of view, and single seat. So single seat multi-role was extremely demanding as far as being able to stay proficient in all the roles that you were tasked with. And remind you, at Han, we had no SEAD mission, the suppression of enemy air defenses. So that was completely out. Our main mission at Han was actually battlefield air interdiction. We did very little close air support, which is like directly on the front line. So battlefield air interdiction would be attacking enemy army targets on the ground, but not right where the enemy meets the friendlies, but maybe 20 miles, 30 miles behind. So these are forces that are not in contact yet, but are expected to be in contact soon. And the mission was to destroy them before they even got to where they could do some harm. All right. So it makes sense. I mean, you want to try to suppress, some of it was attacking targets directly, actual formations of tanks and APCs and, supplies and whatnot, using typically cluster bombs would be a weapon of choice back then. Although later on at Kunsan, I was checked out on the Maverick missile, the AGM-65. So there was another weapon that would have been of great use for that. But sometimes it was attacking choke points like a bridge, so let's just destroy a bridge, or maybe a road, a major road intersection or something like this. You're going to destroy and crater it with various types of ordnance. Bridges, of course, were major choke points, particularly if they were across a major river like the Rhine River or the Elbe River or something like this. So this was really our main mission in the F-16 when I was in Germany. Later on, when I flew at Kunsan, we did way more. Battlefield air interdiction was still a primary mission, but we did a way more close air support at Kunsan than we did at Han. So, the circumstances were different, and so the mass of forces on the ground that the North Korean would have been to put up, the quality might not have been very good necessarily, but they had a ton of artillery and they had a ton of troops. So we did practice a lot of close air support, and a lot of those were done in what the area was called P518, which was right at the border with North Korea. So there was a buffer zone. I think it was about 10 miles of buffer zone where you manner, but right behind that, there were areas where we would practice the close air support in areas that probably would have been the exact same ones that we would have done during actual war, right? So we would get familiar with the terrain. Sometimes we would do close air support from medium altitude due to the fact that one of the main threats from North Korea would have been small arms and AAA fire, and maybe shoulder-fired SAMs, as opposed to North Korea did not have like a lot of mobile SAMs like SA-6s and SA-8s. So and so our normal tactic for CAS would have been from medium altitude. However, one of the big factors was, what if the weather is bad? What if you have low altitude clouds? And so we did practice low altitude CAS, but mainly because of weather considerations. So if we had to do CAS and the weather did not allow high altitude or medium altitude tactics, then we would have to go low. So we did practice both types of tactics, low and medium altitude. One of the memorable flights that I had was we were doing CAS, and the forward air controller airborne. So a lot of time it was A-10s from OSOM. That would be the FAC-A. That's forward air controller airborne. So that's an airplane that basically gives you your targets. Dictates some of the tactics, tell you where the friendlies are. It gives you your what's called a 9-line brief, to prepare you for attacking the target. But one time the FAC-A was an F-14, which was kind of pretty cool.
Oh, wow.
I actually saw the airplane, and so from interviewing F-14 crews that's one of the missions they got into the maybe late 80s to 90s, and that was kind of unusual. And the fact is that F-14 was operating from the Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier that was off the coast of Korea, and during that deployment, I got to go on that carrier. We were also doing. So we were doing CAS. We were also doing DSET against the carrier air wing, so against both the F-14s and F-18s. Then they invited us to go on the carrier for the day. So they packed us in the back end of a C-2 Greyhound, and I got to spend from morning. We didn't spend the night on the carrier, but we spent from morning to evening on the carrier and observing actual operations on the Kitty Hawk, which was absolutely fascinating. So
wow.
These are a lot of stories that, again, how I miss it. I mean, it's just fantastic days.
Absolutely. Some great stories there, Karl. I've got a question here. Actually, I got posted today. So stand by for this. There is an F-111 and an F-16 on their own way. Which one are you jumping into?
F-16.
Wow, really? I thought you were F-111.
I mean, I loved it. Don't get me wrong. I love the F-111. It was a fantastic aircraft. I'm very privileged to have been able to fly it for almost 1,000 hours. I think I remember to one of the interviews, I just missed the 1,000-hour patch because I broke my finger at skiing at Mountain Home, and that grounded me for about 6 weeks, I think. And if it wasn't for that, I'm sure I would have been over 1,000. But anyway, and then I went to the F-16. So I jump. I wish I could fly both of them. This is funny. I actually have dreams sometimes where I'm flying the F-111 or the F-16. And It's not just one or the other. I do have dreams once in a while. It's not, all that often, but once in a while, I dream that I'm back in an F-111 squadron or an F-16 squadron. And it's about 50-50. It's one or the other. So obviously that tells me that I have good memories from both aircraft. But overall, strapping on that F-16 in that bubble canopy, it was just an extraordinary feeling. I can imagine. There was no canopy frame in front.
Yeah, there was no canopy bow, was there? So yeah.
Yeah, canopy bow. There was a little bit of a frame and bit behind you, but you didn't really care that much about that. But the fact, and you were sitting fairly high. The rails on the side of the canopy were relatively low. Mm-hmm. And you could barely see. Of course, that depended on the pilot and how they adjusted their seat, so that part of it was preference. But for me, I could barely see the pitot boom on the radome. I could just see it, but just. And it was just a different feeling. And on top of that, the side stick, to me, I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Of course, the airplane was extremely maneuverable. I don't know. Overall, I would say the F-16, it's just an incredible feeling of power. I think it's going to go down in history as one of the greatest fighter designs ever. Period.
Absolutely.
Now you can say some of the newer airplanes are a little bit more maneuverable, like the Typhoon and the Rafale, maybe. Although, there are some newer F-16s like the Block 70 now. I'd be interested in flying that because the wing area hasn't changed. So, but the thrust and everything, the avionics they've got on it are light years ahead of what I flew. So in my current job, I actually work, a little bit with those airplanes because I work as a contractor on an Air Force program where we develop and maintain software for mission planning, right? And specifically, I work in the foreign military sales department of that branch. So I supervise the delivery of software for mission planning software for all these foreign customers, over 30 countries that have bought F-15s, F-16s, and we also deal with the CF-18 for Canada and the F-2 for Japan.
Nice.
So because the software is tailored to every country, like some of the newer countries like Slovakia and a bunch of countries are buying the Block 70 aircraft, version of the F-16. And so I have to, be informed about some of the capabilities, and it is pretty amazing compared to what I was working with. It's almost a different aircraft. From the outside, you can't tell the difference that much, but the inside is very, very different.
Absolutely,
including they have a different ejection seat now. I understand. So, but what a great aircraft, and I think. In your interviews, I think most people that have flown the F-16 will definitely rank it as one of their favorite aircraft ever. There is, you could argue there is better. And of course, now if you fly the F-16 against an F-35 or F-22 because of the stealth, you're probably not going to end up on top. But unless it's a guns only. If you go guns only, well, even against the F-22, that might still be pretty hard because of the thrust vectoring. But against the F-35, you definitely have a chance. Yeah, guns
absolutely,
only, for sure.
Yeah.
More than a 50-50 chance, but
absolutely. Well, Karl, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sure our viewers are going to enjoy this 2-part interview. But thank you again.